Welcome to our podcast series on diversity and inclusion, brought to you by the Association for Coaching, the world's leading independent professional body dedicated to promoting best practice and raising the standards of coaching worldwide. I'm Dr. Alexandra Morgan, Senior Lecturer and Coach Educator. In this series, we're privileged to be talking to a superb range of coaches and consultants whose work is making a significant contribution to advancing diversity and inclusion in society and in the coaching profession. We hope this series sparks curiosity and encourages change. Hi, I'm Alex Morgan, your podcast host for this series on equality, diversity and inclusion. With me today, I have Julie Scanlon. Hi, Julie.
Hi, Alex. Great to be with you.
Yeah, you too. I'm looking forward to our discussion. So Julie is a consultant in diversity and inclusion and as well as an executive coach. Julie, tell us first, can you, about yourself and your coaching practice?
Thanks, Alex. Yes, I am an executive coach. I support senior leaders in charity sector, public sector, as well as the private sector. And I also support people looking for making a career change. And some of that is part of what I appeal for because I made a significant career change myself a few years ago. I used to be an academic and I changed and now run my own business, providing training, consultancy and coaching.
Thank you. When we had our prep talk for this podcast, we were talking about the word privilege, weren't we? And I'd like to pick that discussion up for today, if that's okay. So tell me about this word privilege and what it means to you.
Yeah, thanks. Privilege is a term that can really raise people's hackles, I find, mostly through not fully understanding what that means. Some people can get a sense of, okay, we're being told we've got white privilege or we've got male privilege, depending on who we are. And people can sometimes feel a little bit uncomfortable with that, as though it means that, every man has it easy, that every white person has it easy. And actually, when we're actually talking about privilege, what we mean is, let's say for a man, what you don't get discriminated against usually is for your gender. You might get discriminated against or harassed or, have challenges around other aspects of your identity. For example, if you're a Black man, if you have a disability, et cetera, et cetera. So as a white woman, something that I don't get harassment about is the color of my skin. So that's what we're talking about when we talk about privilege, really. And the term was popularized by an academic in the States in the late 80s called Peggy McIntosh. And she talked about those of us with privilege. She was particularly interested in white privilege as a white woman. And those of us with privilege, she talks about, have an invisible knapsack that we carry around with us. We're unaware of it. It's weightless. And this invisible knapsack is a beautiful metaphor. She talks about it as, we have a little compass in there, we have maps in there, we have water, we have all the stuff for the journey that people without privilege don't have. They don't have those maps and those guides. And we are almost deliberately, she talks about, we're meant to remain oblivious to our, let's say, white privilege in my case. We're not supposed to sort of see it or recognize it. And this is something that then, in terms of our coaching kind of relationships, the raising awareness of our own relationship to various privileges can be really beneficial.
I love that knapsack analogy. That's great, isn't it?
Brilliant, isn't
it? It's really relatable, isn't it?
Yeah.
Tell us a bit more about this raising awareness of our own privileges as coaches. What could we do? What should we do? What help might we look for?
Yeah, thanks. I have a little exercise, which, if it's okay, I'll ask listeners to take part in. And I should say that what we're mostly focusing on today is male privilege and heteronormative privilege. And that word heteronormative, if that's new to people, and understandably it may well be, it simply means the way that the world and our social world and our workplaces are structured as though everyone is straight. as though everyone has kind of heterosexual orientation. And we're focusing on these two because these are those elements of my particular specialism, really. Could be talking about race, ethnicity, we could be talking about disability. So I'm just giving that as a preliminary for this, what I'm calling the privilege quiz.
Okay, good.
This is adapted from Peggy McIntosh's work. So what I'm going to ask listeners to do, and you can do this if you're cooking, if you're jogging, whatever you're doing as you're listening to this podcast, it's really simple. You don't need to write anything down. But I'm just going to say 8 statements, and I'm going to ask you to give yourself a point for each statement that you can confidently agree with. So that's confidently agree. So if you're like, not sure, then don't give yourself a point. So 8 statements that I'll just read out slowly and mentally give yourself a point. So first one, I can go shopping, take public transport, or carry out errands at any time of the day or night without fear of being followed or harassed. Secondly, I can hold my partner, girlfriend, boyfriend, or spouse's hand in public without being harassed or looked at strangely. Third one, I can refer openly to my sexual orientation without fear of being judged by those around me. Number 4, I see people like me represented in imagery around my workplace, if you're in a workplace, and or in wider society, such as on TV, on billboards, etc. 5, no one has ever incorrectly assumed my sexual orientation. Our 6th statement, I don't have to consider how I speak, dress, or look before entering a space without fear that it will be attributed to my gender or sexual orientation. Number 7, I can live where I choose and can move when and where I choose and expect to be welcomed there. And our final one, I can take exercise in public spaces, such as going jogging in a park, without fear of being harassed.
Thank you, Julie. Really thought-provoking. And I couldn't confidently say yes to all of them. And it provokes a sense of frustration, of hurt, doesn't it? When you can't confidently say yes to all of them.
Yeah.
And do you find that in your work with your coachees?
Yeah, I mean, this exercise is something I do with, not with coachees as such, but with people in training situations. And sometimes I've done this with groups of coaches to help us become aware. And what tends to come up are, that increase in self-awareness and destigmatization of that word privilege when we start thinking about it in these very, very everyday terms. Some of what it really brings out, I think, is the perception of ourselves as well, and our own relationship to the world, which obviously is very interesting for us as coaches and in terms of supporting our clients. As a woman and as a lesbian, for example, I actually score myself 0 on all of that. There are no statements I can confidently say yes to. So this kind of sense of perception, some of these everyday activities, what we might think about are, the frames in the world that our coachees and us and that we all move around in. And some of them might be termed microaggressions, these little things. But the thing about a microaggression is it's a small thing. It's a bit like a mosquito bite. If you have one, it's irritating. But if you've been like me to a Greek island and you're the sort of person that gets hundreds of them and comes back recovered,
yeah, me too.
Exactly. Then it becomes somewhat overwhelming and starts to kind of dominate your sense of yourself. I am full of mosquito bites.
Yeah.
So in our coaching practice, being aware that, we're always trying to support the individual in front of us and kind of, hold that supportive, challenging space for that individual. It's just being aware that that individual's frames and experiences could be very, very different to our own. Without realizing it, we do kind of bring in our unconscious biases, our unconscious sort of expectations around things that I think other people's truths and experiences can be very different. So just helping recognize that sort of everydayness, I think, is important in a coaching space. These coachees in front of us may well be experiencing barriers that are invisible to us if we have certain sorts of privilege ourselves.
As you're speaking, I'm recalling something that happened earlier on in my practice as a coach, when I was encouraging a young woman to be more assertive, to have a stronger voice. And she shot straight back with, well, it's okay for you. And that really pulled me up short. It's okay for you. And it made me think, well, yeah, what assumptions am I making here about my client and the world in which they operate? What we went on to talk about after that was the sense of systemic oppression around how she saw herself and her own background. It was just as you were talking that kind of sprang to mind, but I was wondering whether, is that the sort of thing you mean when you're talking about raising awareness?
Yeah, it is certainly. And I think that, your examples just brought front of mind an example that I have of this when I was coaching a Black woman. She was a middle up manager, and she was part of her frame, if you like, was she wanted to be more assertive, but in that there is that stereotype of the kind of the too brash Black woman. There's something there about race and the way that Black women in particular are pigeonholed as if you're speaking up, you're too loud, etc., more so than a white woman, for example. And so this frame, there was a curious kind of relationship there between me as a white woman and coaching this Black woman who was very conscious of those frameworks, very much clued up, both obviously from her personal experience, but part of what she worked in. And for me as a coach, it's to, my role there, I felt, is to sort of sit back, listen to that experience and support that person around it. And something that obviously we try to do is, as coaches, is bring our empathy into that space and sort of stand alongside the person. We can't be that person, but we sort of stand alongside in that empathic way. So that kind of awareness just helps this kind of awareness of our privilege helps us to build that understanding, to recognize, it would be inappropriate to be in that person's shoes, but to bring that to the supportive space and bring our openness and our non-judgmental practice, which is what we're always striving for, into that space around the different experiences that people can have, in a workplace, for example. So I think it is that being aware of the frames and then just being able to hold that space when those frames come into play in the coaching dynamic as well.
Building on what you're saying, I'm wondering whether just assuming a non-judgmental frame is enough, really. And earlier we were talking, our lens, if you like, for this particular session is heteronormative privilege. And as a heterosexual coaching gay clients, for example, is it enough to just sit in that non-judgmental space? That feels quite passive to me. I don't know what your thoughts are around that.
I think that's a really interesting one. For a gay client or a lesbian client or a bisexual client, for example, these clients, we all have had experiences where we're unsure if the space is safe to bring our full selves into that space. We will all have had experiences, well, pretty much all, of some sort of harassment, some sort of a sense of discrimination. And I think that as a coach, trying to create that safe space, all we can do is to kind of try and build that rapport and build that trust in order for the client to be able to, if they wish to, I'm doing air quotes here, I know listeners can't see me, but if they wish to out themselves and come out, that's on their grounds and on their territory. Because clients will have experienced almost certainly this sense of, okay, is this space safe? Each time we go into a new space, a different space, making a different relationship as we would with a coach, it is like, is this going to be safe to be myself? We don't know that yet.
Mm-hmm.
Because we know there is judgment out there, because we know there's misunderstanding, are
Mm-hmm.
people going to get it? Are people going to get what this whole thing is, what it is to be different from the expected norm, in inverted commas again, in those sort of air quotes. So I think that it is really down to the coachee to bring and be open in that space. But what coaches can be doing is putting on your website, let's say, that you're LGBT friendly, or whatever term you wish to use, that you welcome clients from, diverse communities, for example. Just being explicit around that can help people think, oh, okay, they've thought about this, and even if they're not reading you as a member of that community yourself, it could still just be a little signifier of, you're welcome. All people are welcome. So that is something that we can do, but recognizing, I think, that always clients they're going to suss that out, and that's going to kind of emerge within coaching conversations if they wish to sort of be out about their sexual orientation. But I mean, for me, I know, I don't pitch myself as a coach, particularly for LGBT people or for women, but I do get a disproportionate number, I think, of clients that are in those demographics. And that's partly because of the other part of my work is around the consultancy and training. And I've got those words are on my website kind of thing. And so I know that people have chosen me. They've explicitly said they've chosen me for that.
Thank you. Tell us a little bit more about that consultancy and training then, Julie, to give people a full picture of your work.
Yeah, thanks. I do training around all sorts of aspects of diversity and inclusion. Worked in the kind of the corporate sector and private and third sector or charity sector as well, and particularly hone in then, as well as the sort of what you might want to call generalist training. So that might be things around privilege, indeed, around unconscious and structural bias, but specific things around including women and sort of including LGBT people as well, particularly focused on sexual orientation. So I draw on some of my academic work for that. And some of the consultancy work tends to be sort of research and facilitation of conversations around diversity and inclusion. So it might be facilitating focus groups and questionnaires and interviews, sort of the cultural piece, if you like, of how people are feeling about the diversity in the organisation and that kind of thing. My work sort of, I suppose it comes under an umbrella of trying to support people both through the coaching and from the bigger organisational sense, to be the best that they can be within their workplaces or within their lives, really. So the two things kind of dovetail in that respect for me.
I always think there's a balance, isn't there? As coaches, there is the, helping the individual to thrive, to not just survive, but to thrive in their workplace, if we're talking about the context of executive coaches. But there's also the organisation. Often the organisation needs more fixing in a sense than the coachee. So, and that is to do with structural stuff.
Yeah.
As you mentioned just now. Have you got any guidance for coaches who are aware that they've got these two elements going on in their coaching?
Yeah, I know exactly what you're trying to say. And one of the words that is coming to mind is from an Australian academic, and her name has fallen out of my head, who talks about us needing a bifocal approach. And again, this is a lovely metaphor. So when we've got the coachee in front of us, we're one-to-one with that individual, we're taking the sort of the smaller vision, if you like, the vision closest to us, of supporting that individual to be the best that they can within that space, be the best that they can and perform within that space. The client may well be aware of it could be a pretty toxic work environment. It could really need a lot of shifting, that kind of the structural environment that they're in. They may or may not be aware of that. So some of it can be, if we've got that sense emerging, some of that can be kind of raising awareness, encouraging the client, just that gentle support to spot what's within their control, what's within their influence and what's out of it. There's that sort of little circle from Stephen Covey that's coming to mind. As coaches, if we are commissioned by the organization and they're supporting, they're paying us, it could be that we wish to take on that responsibility and to think about the longer lens. It could be that we wish to bring something to the organization itself and say, there are some long-term issues, big structural issues that I'm seeing need addressing. If we have several clients within that space, we can be we can keep the anonymity. It's all really going to depend upon the delicacy of the situation. But that could be a way that we are able to, as external people, come in. And again, it's going to have to be very diplomatic. It's going to have to be very delicate, but it is something that we might be able to raise if there are these big, broader structural issues that we are noticing. I mean, I feel really lucky in my work because I work at both ends of the, the bifocal thing, the long view in sort of helping organizations and, staff within those organizations, then in the smaller view of the sort of one-to-one coaching relationships as well. So I feel very lucky to be working in each of those strands. But I think as coaches, there is perhaps something we can do if we're spotting those patterns. There's something we can do in raising awareness with the organisation if we can do it, keeping confidentiality.
I agree, but it's always the challenge, isn't it, when you're a coach in an organisation, is to where your responsibility, if you like, lies for that.
Yeah.
But I think given that most of us, I'm going to make a massive sweeping statement here, but I believe that most of us are in coaching in order to effect some kind of societal change. We probably have a duty to do that, don't we?
Yeah.
We were talking about raising awareness of privilege in ourselves as coaches. I wondered if you could talk a little bit more about how we can use this awareness to support our clients. So I know we've talked around some of that, but feel free to make points we've already made. But it would be nice to come back to that and to have our listeners feel that they're more equipped, maybe than they were at the beginning of this conversation.
Yeah, thanks. Other things that we can do, being aware of that privilege, it can be sometimes to support people to recognize their own situations, as we do with coaches, where they sit on that. I wouldn't want to use a privilege scale or anything like that at all. That's really a way too blunt an instrument for a coaching relationship. But we can gently sort of help people see that there are these structural issues, perhaps, that it's not just them. Quite often, I think, I definitely notice with my coaching clients, for example, they feel often they're the only one. They're the only one with all of these struggles. And that could be women that get knocked back for promotion. I'll just give that as an example, 2 or 3 times, and they're not really getting proper feedback, et cetera, et cetera. But we know, there's research and there's academic research on that this is exactly what happens. This is what happens to women. So there's something about having that broader lens that it's quite often not the client's fault, in inverted commas again. But so something we can perhaps do is helping to broaden out, if we have that knowledge, if we have some awareness. So, things around the harassment, discrimination, things about the gender pay gap and LGBT pay gap, etc. All of these things are part of the bigger framework that each of our coaches is within, but they might not be, aware of that. If you're an accountant, for example, that's not your business necessarily to know about all of that stuff. So if we do have sort of, a little map of knowledge of how these things operate, it can help us to open up those frameworks, I think, as well. And we can gently use that within our coaching sessions with our clients to support them to recognize it's not just them, and then to move forward with, how they might move forward within the reality that they are existing in, if you like.
Thank you. I think that's incredibly helpful. And, you used to occupy the academic space, and I'm in that currently. And I do agree with you that there's a great deal of information and research, not just coaching research, but research around issues of equality, diversity, and inclusion, that as coaches we can be better informed about. And I think sharing that information and the research with individuals, just as you said, Julie, I absolutely agree with you, helps people to realise that they're not alone, as you said. But also, I think, knowledge is power, isn't it? And it gives people a stronger sense of that these issues are more widespread than perhaps people thought. They're not so individualistic, they're more systemic. And I think knowing that gives somebody perhaps more power in the knowledge that they could and should do something about it. There are ways of encouraging or insisting that a wider organisation makes changes, and other organisations have done that. So to look into all of that research as a coach and be very well informed, I think can only be a good thing.
I think that's absolutely right. The more that we're informed as coaches, the more that we can support our clients, really. And what you're saying there is making me think of a couple of things where the messaging that we get in our current neoliberal Western world is, anybody can be anything. If you work hard enough, you'll get there. If you work hard enough, you'll get to the top. Well, interestingly, not everyone can be at the top because there's one spot at the top. So we can't all be there. It would be overcrowded. But our neoliberal, the messaging that we get from media, also from our workplaces, if we're in a workplace, suggests that we can get there if we want to. Whereas actually, the statistics tell us if you're a woman, you're less likely to get there. If you're LGBT, you're less likely to get there. If you have a disability, if you're Black, if you're working class, and that's not a protected characteristic in our law, but it's an aspect of our identity, you're less likely to get there. So if we know that we're supporting our clients with those challenges and the barriers that they're facing, we're able to do that a bit better. What you mentioned there also made me think of the popularity of the term imposter syndrome or imposter phenomenon, which is, interestingly, the word syndrome almost it kind of individualizes it. It makes it as if it is a medical condition. When we think of other things that are syndromes, they tend to be medical things. So things like AIDS, things like Down syndrome, for example, off the top of my head. Whereas actually, imposter phenomenon, which was the original term from, again, a couple of academics in the States, Clance and Imes, they use the term imposter phenomenon, which is very different from syndrome. Phenomenon, for me, allows it to be, we're looking at a broader lens there. We're not individualizing it. So whenever we're talking about imposter syndrome phenomenon, I use that word phenomenon. And the sense of, this all kind of links into our sense of privilege. Some people are going to be suffering from imposter phenomenon because they are in the particular demographic groups that are discriminated against, whether it's overtly or covertly, which is obviously much harder to call out. So the more that we're aware as coaches of these bigger structural things, the better kind of informed, the better we can kind of sit in that space and support that client, I think, in front of us.
Thank you. Julie, I've really enjoyed this conversation. I have learned many things from the conversation. I hope others will have done. I love the knapsack analogy and totally agree with you about the use of the term syndrome with the imposter syndrome. I've always found really uncomfortable with that, and will now start using the word phenomenon after imposter. So thank you for that. And the exercise, I just want to remind listeners, the exercise that Julie shared with us at the beginning, I imagine that generated a lot of thought and maybe new thought for you. And you can take that awareness into your practice. Julie, is there anything that you would like to say just as a closing comment or closing statement?
Not much, thanks, Alex. I think that if people want to look up the original piece where that's adapted from, that quiz, is Peggy McIntosh. And I think there'll be a link along with the podcast for that. And you'll see that, her work on white privilege is very interesting to which I've kind of adapted here for these other areas. So I really recommend looking at Peggy McIntosh's work and helping. It will just help reflect on these kind of bigger social issues that we've been talking about today.
Thank you. Wonderful. I've really enjoyed the conversation, Julie. Thank you very much.
And thanks for having me, Alex.
No doubt people will want to be in touch with you to learn even more.
People are welcome to get in touch. Thank you.
Thank you. So thank you for listening to another podcast by the Association for Coaching. I've been Alex Morgan. Our purpose is to inspire and champion coaching excellence, to advance the coaching profession and make a sustainable difference to individuals, organisations and in turn society. If you'd like to find out more, please follow us on LinkedIn and explore our webpage at theassociationforcoaching.com. There you can keep up to date with our latest episodes and conversations, as well as our digital learning calendar.